Tokyo, March 1941. A Japanese naval intelligence officer sits in a dim briefing room, staring at grainy reconnaissance film like it's a crime scene. He runs the same few seconds again and again. Pause, rewind, measure, count. He isn't watching for drama. He's watching for a warning, because the footage shows something that should not have worked. Old British biplanes, slow, fabric-covered planes that look like leftovers from the last war, had smashed a modern battleship force in a single night. Not out on the open sea, in a harbor, behind layered defenses built specifically to stop that exact kind of attack. The officer fills his notebook with neat, careful notes. Approach angles, the spacing between attack waves, where the torpedoes enter the water, how the defensive fire shifts when the first explosions hit. He isn't studying Italian mistakes as a joke. He's studying fear. And what scares him is not the obvious lesson. Carriers can hit battleships in port. That part is easy to copy if a Navy has the planes, the training, and the guts. The deeper lesson is worse. If Britain could do this with outdated aircraft and young crews flying into darkness, what could Britain do with better carriers, better planes, and a Navy that had been practicing this kind of warfare for years? Around that same time, Axis observers in Tokyo noticed something changing inside Japan's Navy. German liaison officers reported that Japanese planners didn't just pick apart the British strike to imitate it. They also treated it like a red flag, a proof that the British, of all people, might be the most dangerous opponent in carrier warfare. To understand why, the story has to go back to the night Britain pulled off the impossible, November 11th, 1940, Taranto, Italy, night. The Italian Navy had concentrated major battleships in Taranto harbor in an anchorage that was supposed to be safe. The defenses looked strong on paper. Anti-aircraft guns around the harbor, searchlights ready to paint the sky, barrage balloons floating overhead to mess with bombers. On top of that, the water was shallow. Too shallow, many experts believed, for a proper aerial torpedo attack. Standard torpedoes needed more room to settle and run. In shallow water, they'd smash into the bottom. So the logic was simple. A carrier strike could hurt ships at sea. Sure, but in this harbor, against these defenses, torpedoes shouldn't work. The British attacked anyway. From the carrier HMS Illustrious, they launched Fairy Swordfish, biplanes so outdated their own crews joked about them. They were slow. They had open cockpits. They looked fragile. The kind of aircraft people underestimate right up until it's too late. The strike came in two waves, and in the space of roughly an hour and a half, the results stunned the naval world. Several Italian battleships were put out of action. Littorio, one of Italy's newest and most powerful, was hit by torpedoes and sank down into the harbor mud. Caio Duilio was badly damaged. Conte di Cavour was hit and later proved a total loss. In one night, Italy's battle line took a blow that changed the balance in the Mediterranean, and Britain paid a tiny price for it. Only a couple of aircraft lost. That alone is shocking. But here's the part that really matters. Britain didn't win because it had more planes. It didn't win because its technology was magically better. It won because it outthought the defenses. The British used modified torpedoes designed for shallow water. They practiced low, controlled approaches that kept planes hard to track at night. They used flares and distractions to confuse gunners and split attention. They attacked from angles that made defensive coordination messy and late. This was not a lucky punch. It was a clean surgical operation, and that kind of skill hits different. It tells an enemy something uncomfortable. This Navy has been working on these problems longer than you have. If you're into the hidden mechanics of World War II, how smart planning beats raw power, make sure you follow the channel, because this series stays in the details most videos skip. Now, fast forward, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japan launches the largest carrier-based strike the world had ever seen. The plan is precise. The timing is deliberate. Torpedoes are adapted for shallow water. The attack comes in waves. There are diversionary strikes meant to overload American defenses. The focus is on battleships sitting in an anchorage that feels protected until it isn't. And whether Japan admitted it openly or not, the parallels to Taranto were hard to miss. Taranto didn't cause Pearl Harbor by itself, but it proved the concept in the real world. It showed what worked, what failed, and what had to be solved, especially the shallow water torpedo problem. Japan took that toolkit and scaled it up. Pearl Harbor was devastating. Battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. The raid achieved surprise. It shocked the United States and reshaped the war. So here comes the paradox, the part that the Tokyo intelligence officer in 1941 was really wrestling with. Japan proved it could execute the Taranto-style method better than anyone. Japan had strong carriers, skilled pilots, and the confidence to strike deep. But after Pearl Harbor, Japan almost never tried anything comparable against Britain's carrier forces. Not against Britain's Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean. Not in moments when British carriers were present, but not fully protected. Not in situations that, on paper, looked tempting. Japan would attack British ships, yes. Japan would raid ports and sink isolated units, yes. But committing the main carrier force into a direct contest with British carrier groups, that was another story. And this wasn't random bad luck or missed chances. Contemporary observers, especially German partners watching from the sidelines, noticed a consistent pattern. Japanese commanders showed a kind of caution around British carrier concentrations that they didn't show around American or Dutch forces. That is the real legacy of Taranto. Taranto didn't just teach Japan how to do a carrier strike. It taught Japan who might be most dangerous in a carrier war, and why. Because Taranto suggested something deeper than hardware. It suggested experience, a doctrine built through years of trial, error, and refinement. The kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't show up in a single blueprint. You can copy a torpedo modification. You can copy a wave schedule. You can even copy a target list, but you can't copy 20 years of carrier thinking overnight. And that knowledge gap can mess with even a confident Navy. It creates hesitation. It plants doubt. It makes commanders ask the question they hate most. What else do they know that we don't? In the next part, that doubt shows up in the open when Japan's most powerful carrier strike force enters British waters in 1942, gets eyes on targets, and then makes a decision that surprises almost everyone watching. April 1942. The Indian Ocean. Japan's top carrier force, fast, sharp, and battle-tested, moves into waters Britain considers its backyard. This is the same striking arm that tore through Pearl Harbor months earlier. Multiple fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, veteran air crews who, at this point in the war, feel almost unstoppable. On the map, it looks like a perfect setup. British bases are spread out, shipping lanes are exposed. The distances are huge. And if Japan wants to break Britain's hold on the region, this is how you do it, by knocking out ports, crippling logistics, and hunting the enemy fleet. And Japan does exactly that, at least at first. Raids hit key harbors, facilities get bombed, merchant shipping takes heavy losses. The attacks show planning, range, and confidence. The message is clear. Japan can reach here too. But then something strange starts showing up in the pattern. What Japan doesn't do, because Britain's Eastern Fleet is operating in the same general theater. British carriers and battleships are not imaginary. They are out there. They are moving. And Japanese reconnaissance does, at times, pick up pieces of them. One of the clearest examples involves isolated British ships. Recon aircraft locate HMS Hermes and HMS Vampire, valuable targets but not fully protected by the main British carrier concentration. Japan strikes them and sinks them. It is decisive and brutal, the kind of result Japan's carrier doctrine is built to produce. But the timing matters. The attack comes when those ships are separated and exposed, not when they're sitting under the umbrella of a concentrated British carrier group. And when reconnaissance reports point toward the larger British force, including carriers, Japan's behavior shifts. Instead of pressing toward a risky fleet confrontation, the Japanese carriers pull back. Not because they suddenly forget how to fight, not because they lack courage, not because their planes can't reach. They withdraw because the tactical situation changes from hit an isolated target to deal with British carriers as a group. This is where German observers, attached to Japanese command circles and hungry for aggressive action, start noticing something they can't explain with simple numbers. In reports and correspondence from that period, Axis partners describe Japanese commanders as unusually cautious when British carrier strength is present and concentrated. The same caution does not appear in descriptions of Japanese decision-making against American or Dutch forces in comparable situations. And that difference is the key. Because if Japan feared carriers as a concept, Pearl Harbor never happens. Japan clearly believed in carrier warfare. Japan leaned into it. What Japan feared was the idea that British carrier forces were different in method, different in experience, different in how they solved problems at sea. That fear goes back to Taranto. After Taranto, Japan did not just watch the film and move on. Japanese naval intelligence pushed hard to get detailed accounts, including information passed through Axis-sharing channels. The Italian side produced after-action reporting that included defensive timings, gunnery patterns, and how the British attack broke the rhythm of the harbor's night defenses. Those details mattered because Taranto was not a dumb luck raid. It was a tightly organized night operation launched from a carrier, something that, at the time, was still rare and technically demanding. Taranto included low-level approaches, timing tricks, and shallow water solutions that made the harbor's math meaningless. And from Japan's perspective, that suggested a dangerous truth. Britain had been working on carrier warfare for a long time, not just building carriers, but building habits, training systems, night procedures, navigation discipline, coordination between planes, ships, and intelligence, the kind of organizational muscle memory that turns a risky plan into a repeatable method. This is where institutional knowledge becomes more than a fancy phrase. Think of it like this. You can copy a move you saw in a fight, but you can't copy the years of training that make someone calm under pressure. You can mimic the technique. You can't instantly mimic the mindset. Taranto looked like mindset, a navy confident enough to send slow planes into heavy defenses at night, knowing the plan would hold together under fire. That perception shaped Japan's planning in a quiet but powerful way. As the war expands, Japan repeatedly chooses safer tools against British naval power, especially when carriers are involved. Submarines, for example, are used aggressively against merchant shipping. That's consistent with Japan's need to cut supply lines and punish logistics. Commerce raiding is effective, and it's also less risky than trying to force a carrier-to-carrier showdown against an opponent you respect. Surface raiders and aircraft also strike when conditions are favorable, like when a target is isolated or when airfields are within range of land-based planes. But the line Japan seems reluctant to cross is committing its main carrier force into a direct contest with British carrier groups when those groups are together and ready. German officials and intelligence leaders grow frustrated with this. Germany wants pressure applied across the board. In their view, Japan has the carriers and aircraft to make Britain bleed in the Indian Ocean. So why not hunt the British carriers hard? The problem is that Japan's risk calculation is not based only on countable things like how many carriers are on each side. It's also based on what Taranto suggested, that Britain might be more dangerous in carrier combat than its numbers alone imply. That idea becomes even clearer when you look at how Japan handles British capital ships early in the war. December 10, 1941, off Malaya. Britain's Force Z, HMS Prince of Wales, and HMS Repulse steams into danger without carrier air cover. These are major ships operating in a way that by 1941 is becoming increasingly risky. The situation is exactly what naval air power is designed to exploit. Big ships exposed, far from friendly fighter protection. Japan attacks and sinks both ships. It's one of the most famous demonstrations of air power in the entire war. But here's the revealing detail. Japan uses land-based aircraft, not carriers, even though Japanese carrier forces exist in the broader region. Why would Japan do that? One practical answer is simple availability and planning. Land-based units in range can be tasked quickly and in volume. Carriers can be held back for larger strategic goals. But there is also a pattern. When the target is British and valuable, Japan often prefers methods that do not gamble the carrier force itself. Land-based bombers and torpedo planes can be expended. Crews can be replaced. Airfields can keep generating sorties. But a carrier, especially in 1942, is a crown jewel. It's not just a ship. It's a floating airbase, a command tool, and a strategic threat all at once. Japan's carriers are essential for operations across the Pacific, and Japan's leadership knows, even in early 1942, that carrier losses could change the entire war. So if Japan believes British carrier crews have a special edge, experience, doctrine, coordination, then risking the carrier force against them starts looking like a bad trade. This is where the paradox from Part 1 comes into full view. Japan studied Taranto with intense focus. Japan copied the shallow water solutions and the strike logic. Japan used the method at Pearl Harbor at a massive scale. But the deeper takeaway from Taranto wasn't, "This is a cool trick." It was, "These people are experts." And expertise changes behavior. It makes commanders hesitate even when they hold the numerical advantage. It pushes planning toward avoidance rather than collision. It turns, "We can probably win," into, "What if they know something we don't?" By 1942 and into 1943, the pattern hardens. Japanese operations in British-controlled waters prioritize shipping and expose targets. Recon keeps watch. Submarines prowl. Raids hit ports and infrastructure. But direct, deliberate carrier versus carrier battles against British groups do not happen, not because no one ever finds the other side, not because the oceans are too big, but because, again and again, Japan chooses not to force the issue when British carriers are concentrated, and the question becomes unavoidable. How many times can that be coincidence before it's policy? In Part 3, that policy becomes undeniable. The numbers stack up, the missed opportunities become documented, and even post-war questioning points back to the same root cause. Taranto didn't just teach Japan how to strike, it taught Japan who they didn't want to fight. By mid-1943, the pattern is no longer subtle. Japanese naval forces in and around the Indian Ocean are active, dangerous, and often effective, but they are selective in how they spend risk. Submarines go after merchant shipping. Surface units probe routes and isolated convoys when the opportunity is clean. Air attacks hit ports and facilities when the odds look good. But when British carrier groups are present and concentrated, Japanese commanders repeatedly choose the same move. They do not engage. This wasn't a one-off decision by one cautious admiral on one weird day. It shows up across time, across operations, and across different types of contact. German observers noticed it too, and they didn't hide their frustration. From Germany's perspective, Japan had the tool Britain feared most: fleet carriers and trained air groups. Germany wanted Japan to apply that tool directly against Britain's naval power in the Indian Ocean. Instead, the Japanese approach looks like a careful business decision. Hit what is exposed, avoid what can hit back in unpredictable ways. And the word unpredictable matters here, because when Japan studied Taranto, it didn't just see a British victory. It saw British creativity under pressure, tactical problem-solving that made defenses meaningless. The key danger was not that Britain had carriers. Japan had carriers too. The danger was that Britain seemed to understand carrier warfare as a system, a science, at a depth that couldn't be measured by counting decks or aircraft. That's what institutional knowledge looks like in combat. It's the difference between owning the equipment and truly mastering the craft. Taranto screamed mastery. It was a carrier strike conducted at night against heavy defenses, in conditions many professionals had written off as impossible for torpedoes. It involved shallow water solutions, timing, coordination, and navigation discipline that didn't happen by accident. So when Japan later considered direct carrier battles with Britain, the question wasn't just, do we have more planes today? The question was, what do they know that we haven't learned yet? That question can paralyze even a strong force, and it helps explain the most telling evidence of all, the record of carrier battles Japan did choose. Look at 1942 in the Pacific. Japan engages American carrier forces repeatedly, even when the tactical picture is unclear, even when intelligence warns of danger, even when conditions are not perfect. Carrier battles happen because Japan believes it must fight for control of the air-sea space, Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, Santa Cruz. Different circumstances, different outcomes, but one consistent fact: Japan is willing to commit carriers into direct high-stakes fights against the U.S. Navy. Now compare that to British carrier forces in overlapping theaters and windows of time. There are periods when the forces operate in the same broader region. There are moments when reconnaissance finds British ships. There are documented cases where contact is possible, and still, major carrier versus carrier fleet actions against Britain do not materialize. Zero. If this were just, the ocean is huge, Japan wouldn't find British ships at all. But Japan does find British ships, especially isolated ones, and hits them hard. That's what makes the avoidance meaningful. It isn't a lack of capability. It's a choice of target type. Japan is comfortable striking British assets when the engagement is one-sided. An isolated carrier, a detached destroyer, a vulnerable convoy, an uncovered capital ship. But Japan becomes cautious when the fight shifts from strike a target to fight a British carrier group. And over time, that caution hardens into doctrine-level behavior. Submarine commanders focus on merchant targets rather than pushing into the teeth of a screened carrier force. Carrier commanders prioritize raids and withdrawal over forcing a fleet collision. Reconnaissance becomes about tracking and avoiding as much as hunting and killing. From the outside, it can look like restraint. From the inside, it looks like respect. And respect is the word that keeps resurfacing, even in blunt assessments from Japan's partners. German intelligence reporting from the period points to something unusual. Japanese commanders appear to treat British carrier forces with a seriousness they do not apply in the same way to American or Dutch forces, even when those forces are strong. That doesn't mean Japanese leaders thought Britain was unbeatable. Japan's carriers in early 1942 are powerful. Japanese pilots are experienced. Aircraft performance is often excellent. This is not a story about British invincibility. It's a story about credibility. Taranto gave Britain credibility in carrier warfare, not on paper, on film, in wreckage, in the cold math of battleships knocked down in a protected harbor. And credibility changes how enemies behave. Here's the irony that sits in the middle of the Pacific War, hiding in plain sight. Japan studied Taranto with intense focus. Japan borrowed the tools, especially the shallow water torpedo concept and the basic strike logic. Japan then executed a massive, historically famous raid at Pearl Harbor that used many of the same core ideas, scaled up and adapted. But after proving it could do the Taranto method at a world-shaking level, Japan spends much of the war avoiding a direct carrier contest with the Navy that demonstrated the method first. That doesn't happen because Japan forgot Taranto. It happens because Japan remembered it too well, and that memory carried a specific message. Britain didn't stumble into carrier warfare. Britain had been building toward it. Britain had been operating carriers earlier than most navies. British doctrine developed over years of experiments, mistakes, and refinements. Long before carrier combat became the headline act of the war, Britain pushed concepts like coordinated carrier operations, difficult flight routines, and night execution in ways that were rare at the time. Taranto wasn't just a successful attack, it was a signature, a stamp that said, "We've been thinking about this longer than you." In post-war questioning of Japanese leadership, the underlying reason becomes clearer, even when phrased carefully. When asked why Japanese carrier forces did not press engagements with British carrier groups despite opportunities and, at times, favorable numbers, Japanese answers point back to British demonstrated expertise and the sense that British carrier operations contained strengths Japan did not fully want to challenge in a straight contest, not because Japan lacked bravery. Because Japan feared losing irreplaceable carriers in a fight where the enemy might outthink them. That's the hidden cost of being first. The United States would build overwhelming numbers of carriers. Japan would field deadly aircraft and highly trained pilots early on. But Britain had years of carrier development behind it. Habits and doctrine formed before the war forced everyone else to learn fast. You can copy equipment changes. You can copy a strike schedule. You can copy an approach profile. You cannot copy a decade of operational culture. And when a Navy believes another Navy possesses that kind of depth, especially in a domain as decisive as carrier warfare, it does the rational thing. It avoids the matchup unless it has no other choice. So when people ask why Japan didn't run another Pearl Harbor on British fleets, the answer isn't because Japan couldn't. It's that Japan didn't want to gamble the carrier force against the one opponent that had already shown, under impossible conditions, what mastery looks like. Taranto didn't only change tactics, it changed perceptions. It planted a respect that survived numbers, survived confidence, and survived the temptation of easy headlines. That is why Taranto's real legacy isn't just the raid itself, or even Pearl Harbor. It's the quiet shadow it cast afterward, shaping what Japan chose not to do. And in war, what commanders refuse to risk can tell you as much as what they choose to attack. Next time, the story moves to the desert, where German tank commanders reportedly changed their behavior around one British unit in North Africa, leaving a paper trail that reads like a warning more than a report.